Deep within the scorched ruins of Old Yharnam, past the charred buildings and the desperate warning signs, past the beast patients that prowl through smoke-filled streets and the corpses strung up as warnings to intruders, there exists a chapel. The Church of the Good Chalice, they call it, though precious little good remains in that forsaken place. The vines that creep through shattered windows are sickly, wrong somehow, as if they feed on something other than sunlight. Their leaves are mottled with patches of crimson that suggest they've taken root in blood-soaked earth. The air itself feels heavy, thick with the weight of old sins and older sorrows, carrying the scent of ash and something sweeter, more cloying, the smell of decay masked by incense long since burned away. And there, at the altar, hunched over something precious and terrible, waits the blood-starved beast. The journey to reach this creature is itself an education in suffering. Old Yharnam sprawls before you like an open wound, a district that time has not healed because the trauma inflicted upon it was too severe for time to touch. Every street tells stories of that final night when fire consumed everything, when hunters descended with torch and blade to purge the district of its plague. You pass buildings whose walls still bear the scorch marks of those flames, structures that lean at impossible angles because their foundations were weakened by heat intense enough to crack stone. You navigate around obstacles that were once people's homes, their belongings scattered in the streets where desperate residents abandoned them while fleeing the flames or the hunters or the transformation that was overtaking them all. The beast patients you encounter on your way to the Church of the Good Chalice are remnants of that catastrophe. Some retain scraps of human clothing, tattered vestments that mark them as former clergy or citizens who once walked these streets with purposes beyond simply surviving another hour. They move with a mixture of aggression and confusion, attacking out of instinct rather than genuine hostility. Their minds too far gone to distinguish friend from foe. Watch them when they're not aware of your presence, and you might catch moments of almost human behavior. A beast patient pawing at a door as if trying to remember how to open it. Another standing motionless before what might have been its home. A third making sounds that could be attempts at speech if you allow yourself to interpret them generously. These observations prepare you in a way for what waits in the church. They establish that the beasts of Old Yharnam were not always beasts, that transformation is not a complete erasure of identity, but a terrible warping of it, leaving fragments of the original person trapped inside a form that can no longer express human thoughts or intentions. The beast patients are tragic, certainly, but their tragedy feels distant, impersonal. They are victims in aggregate, a mass of suffering that your mind can process by abstracting it, by seeing the forest rather than the individual trees. The blood-starved beast denies you that comfortable distance. When you step through the chapel doors and your eyes adjust to the dim interior, when you see the creature hunched at the altar, there is no abstracting what you're witnessing. This is not suffering in the aggregate. This is suffering personified, given form and focus, demanding that you recognize it as individual and immediate and impossible to ignore. When you first lay eyes upon this creature, understanding doesn't come immediately. Your mind struggles to process what it's seeing, trying to categorize it according to known patterns: beast, monster, enemy. But those categories don't quite fit. There's something fundamentally disturbing about its form. Something that reaches past the simple revulsion of encountering a monster and touches something deeper, more primal. Perhaps it's the way its skin hangs from its skeletal frame like a grotesque shawl, flayed back from its spine in deliberate, methodical cuts that speak to intention rather than accident. Perhaps it's the malnourished, desperate quality to its movements, the way it stalks toward you with the single-minded hunger of something that has been denied too long. Or perhaps it's something you sense without conscious thought, that this creature was not always a beast, that transformation was inflicted upon it rather than occurring naturally. that every aspect of its appearance is the result of choices made by others who viewed it as something to be used rather than someone to be respected. The blood-starved beast stands as one of Bloodborne's most viscerally disturbing enemies, and not simply because of the challenge it presents to hunters who face it. No, the true horror of the blood-starved beast lies in what it represents, in the story written across its mutilated form. To understand this creature is to understand one of the darkest chapters in Yharnam's already blood-soaked history. It's a story of exploitation and transformation, of holy institutions turning sacred bonds into something unspeakable, of women chosen for their purity only to have that purity become the instrument of their destruction. This is not a story about hunting beasts. This is a story about what turns people into beasts and what those transformations cost. The blood-starved beast didn't come into being through accident or misfortune. It was created methodically and with purpose by the very institutions that claim to offer salvation. And before we can fully grasp the horror of what the beast has become, we must first understand what it once was and the world that allowed its creation. Old Yharnam sits in the valley below the rest of the city, abandoned and forgotten by all save those who cannot forget. To reach it, you must descend through the tombs beneath Cathedral Ward, passing through darkness until you emerge into a different kind of darkness. The district sprawls before you, a monument to catastrophe. Buildings lean at impossible angles, their foundations weakened by flame. Smoke still rises from some structures, though the fires that consumed this place burned out long ago. That persistent smoke speaks to something deeper burning here, something that cannot be extinguished by time or distance. The architecture tells its own story. These were once homes, shops, gathering places where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. You can still see the remnants of that normalcy in the careful stonework, in the way streets were laid out to facilitate community and commerce. Old Yharnam was not always a graveyard. It was, once upon a time, simply Yharnam. It was the heart of the city, the place where blood ministration first took root and changed the world. But that was before the plague came, before the Ashen blood, before the burning. The Ashen blood was a sickness that baffled the scholars and physicians of its time. The symptoms resembled poisoning, a creeping corruption that spread through the population like wildfire. Those afflicted found their blood itself turning against them, becoming toxic and infectious. The excretions of the sick carried the disease to others, creating a cascade of suffering that threatened to consume not just Old Yharnam, but all of the city above. The cause of this plague remains mysterious, though the timing raises questions. The disease appeared at a moment when the healing church stood to benefit greatly from demonstrating the necessity of blood ministration. Some have noted this convenient timing and drawn their own conclusions, though the truth may never be fully known. What we do know is that the Ashen blood created the perfect conditions for the church to establish its authority in Old Yharnam, offering salvation to a desperate population through blood ministration. Antidotes provided temporary relief, but never true healing. The people of Old Yharnam suffered, and in their suffering, they became desperate. And desperation, as the healing church well knew, makes people receptive to miracles. When the church arrived with its promise of healing through blood ministration, the people of Old Yharnam embraced it without question. How could they not? They were dying, and the church offered life. But the old blood came with a price that no one could have anticipated. The healing was real. There's no denying that. Those who received blood ministration found their ailments cured, their strength renewed. But the blood wanted something in return. It demanded transformation, a remaking of human flesh into something else entirely. And slowly, inexorably, the people of Old Yharnam began to change. The transformation into a beast is not instantaneous. It's a gradual process, a slow corruption that begins with subtle alterations and ends in complete metamorphosis. First comes the enhanced senses, the heightened strength and stamina. These might seem like gifts at first, improvements on the fragile human form. But then the changes become more pronounced. The body begins to warp, bones elongating and reshaping themselves. Fur sprouts from skin. The mind, too, undergoes transformation, human thoughts giving way to beastly instincts until finally, nothing of the original person remains. The scholars of Byrgenwerth had discovered this terrible truth years before in the ruins of Loran, an ancient civilization that had fallen to the same fate. Master Willem understood the danger and preached his famous adage, "Fear the old blood." But his student Lawrence believed differently. Lawrence saw in the blood not a curse, but an opportunity, a means for humanity to transcend its limitations and ascend to something greater. He founded the Healing Church on this belief, convinced that he could harness the transformative power of the old blood while avoiding the pitfalls that had destroyed Loran. He was wrong. Old Yharnam became ground zero for the scourge of beasts. The Ashen blood had weakened the population, made them desperate and vulnerable. When the Healing Church administered massive quantities of blood ministration to combat the plague, it triggered a transformation on a scale never before seen. The residents of Old Yharnam began turning into beasts by the dozens, then by the hundreds. The district descended into chaos as former neighbors turned on each other with feral rage, as families watched their loved ones lose themselves to the beast within. The Healing Church's response was swift and brutal. They could not allow word of this catastrophe to spread to the rest of Yharnam. If people learned the truth about blood ministration's connection to the beast scourge, the church's entire foundation would crumble. So they made a decision that would haunt the survivors forever. They would burn Old Yharnam to the ground, purge it with flame, and seal it off from the rest of the city. They would erase this failure and pretend it had never happened. Hunters descended into Old Yharnam and set it ablaze, burning buildings and beasts alike. Among them were members of the Powder Kegs, a group of hunters known for their explosive weaponry and unorthodox methods. The hunt that night was merciless and thorough. Those who had not yet transformed were killed alongside those who had, for the church could not risk the scourge spreading. Old Yharnam burned beneath a blood-red moon, and when the flames finally died, the district was sealed, cut off from Cathedral Ward by locked gates and official proclamations. To the citizens of the upper city, Old Yharnam simply ceased to exist. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when the beast scourge is allowed to spread unchecked. But the official story concealed a darker truth. Old Yharnam wasn't sealed to keep the beasts in. It was sealed to keep the secret in. The Healing Church could not allow anyone to learn what had really happened here, could not let the world know that blood ministration had caused the very catastrophe it claimed to prevent. Among the hunters who participated in that terrible night was a man named Djura. He was a member of the Powder Kegs, renowned for both his skill and his kindness. Djura believed in the hunt, believed in protecting humanity from the beasts that threatened it. He carried out his duty that night with the conviction of someone doing righteous work. But in the aftermath, as he stood among the ashes and the corpses, Djura began to question everything he had believed. The beasts they had slaughtered, Djura realized, had once been people. They had not chosen to transform. They had been afflicted with ashen blood, given the church's blood as treatment, and paid the price for trusting in false salvation. These beasts were not monsters to be exterminated. They were victims who deserved compassion, not destruction. And the hunters who had killed them, Djura included, were not heroes. They were executioners carrying out a cover-up for the very institution that had caused the tragedy in the first place. This realization broke something in Djura. He renounced his hunter's vows, forsook his connection to the hunter's dream, and chose a different path. He would remain in Old Yharnam, not to hunt its beasts, but to protect them. He took up residence in the tower above the district, manning a Gatling gun to drive away any hunters who might venture down to continue the slaughter. The beasts of Old Yharnam, Djura declared, had suffered enough. They would not suffer the hunt again, not while he still drew breath. Djura was not alone in this decision. Other hunters joined him in this vigil, and together they have stood guard over Old Yharnam ever since. Signs posted at the entrances warn hunters to turn back, but few heed these warnings. Most see only beasts in need of hunting, not the tragic remnants of a community destroyed by the healing church's hubris. And so Djura continues his lonely vigil, shooting any hunter who refuses to spare the beasts below, trying in his own way to atone for the role he played in their destruction. But Old Yharnam's tragedy extends beyond the burning and the beasts. Hidden in the depths of the district, in a chapel that once served as a place of worship and healing, exists evidence of an even darker chapter in the healing church's history. This is where we find the blood-starved beast, and where we begin to understand the full scope of the horrors the church was willing to commit in pursuit of its goals. To understand the blood-starved beast, we must first understand the blood saints. These were women chosen by the healing church for a very specific purpose, selected for their exceptional merit as vessels for blood. The church groomed them from a young age, training them in the arts of blood ministration and preparing them for their sacred duty. They were nuns, formally, members of the church's clergy, but their role went far beyond typical religious service. Blood saints served as living repositories of healing blood. Their bodies were used to cultivate and refine the old blood, turning it into something that could be administered to the faithful. The process involved repeated blood transfusions, infusing the saints with massive quantities of old blood, and then extracting it after their bodies had processed it. The resulting blood, though less potent than pure old blood, was safer for general use and retained significant healing properties. The mere chance of being treated with a blood saint's blood lent legitimacy to the healing church and its practice of communion. Regular citizens who could not access the church's purest blood could still benefit from the diluted but sanctified blood of a saint. It was a system that reinforced the church's power while creating a sustainable supply of healing blood for the masses. The blood saints themselves occupied a strange position in the church hierarchy, simultaneously venerated for their sacred role and looked down upon for their constant contact with blood and the sick. We know of several blood saints by name. Adela, whom hunters may encounter trapped in the unseen village of Yahargul, is one such saint. Her dialogue reveals much about the psychology of these women. She refers to her blood as lowly, suggesting a deep-seated belief in her own unworthiness despite her sacred status. She is desperate to prove her value through the only thing she has to offer, her blood. This desperation speaks to years of conditioning, of being taught that her worth lies solely in what can be extracted from her veins. Another blood saint, known simply as Saint Adeline, can be found in the research hall of the hunter's nightmare. By the time we meet her, Adeline has been subjected to horrific experiments by the church, her body grotesquely transformed in pursuit of worthy blood. She is bound to a chair, her head swollen to enormous size, her mind teetering on the edge of revelation and madness. Yet even in this state, she maintains the conditioning of her years as a blood saint. She speaks of her former lesser years and insists that before becoming a research subject, she used to be nothing. The fate of these blood saints is instructive. Adela is paranoid and unstable, driven to murder when she perceives another woman offering blood to a hunter she has formed an attachment to. Adeline has been transformed into something barely human through the church's experiments. Neither has found peace or dignity in their service to the church. They have been used, exploited, and ultimately discarded when their usefulness ended. They are victims of an institution that viewed them not as people, but as resources to be consumed. But the tragedy of the blood saints extends even further than their exploitation during life. Because the old blood they carried in their veins came with the same risk as any blood ministration. The blood saints, more than anyone else, were exposed to massive quantities of old blood. They underwent countless transfusions, their bodies serving as living laboratories for the church's experiments. And inevitably, some of them began to transform. The female beast patients found throughout Old Yharnam and the hunter's nightmare bear striking similarities to the blood-starved beast. They are slender and lack the thick fur of their male counterparts. Their attacks focus on claws and teeth rather than brute strength. Most significantly, they inflict slow poison with their strikes, just as the blood-starved beast does. These similarities have led some to theorize a connection, that female beast patients may represent an intermediate stage of transformation, and that the blood-starved beasts themselves could be former blood saints who underwent complete metamorphosis. This interpretation is supported by several pieces of evidence. The flayed skin of the blood-starved beast appears deliberately removed rather than naturally shed. The crucified blood-starved beast in Old Yharnam, with beast patients gathered around it drinking its blood, suggests a ritualistic practice. And the creature's presence in the Church of the Good Chalice, guarding a holy vessel, implies a former connection to religious service. While we cannot say with certainty that every blood-starved beast was once a blood saint, the evidence points in this direction, painting a picture of exploitation that continues even after transformation. The transformation of a blood saint into a beast patient would have been devastating for the woman experiencing it. Imagine having devoted your life to the church, having willingly subjected yourself to countless transfusions in service of healing others, only to feel your body begin to change in ways you cannot control. The heightened senses that once seemed like blessings become sources of agonizing overstimulation. Your thoughts grow clouded, harder to hold on to. Your body reshapes itself, bones breaking and reforming into new configurations. The carefully cultivated identity of a blood saint, built over years of training and conditioning, begins to slip away as bestial instincts take hold. And through it all, you remain conscious enough to understand what's happening to you, to feel the human part of yourself shrinking as the beast within grows stronger. What happened next is suggested by the evidence we find. The crucified, blood-starved beast with its deliberately flayed skin, the pools of blood collected beneath it, the beast patients gathered to drink from it. The church, it appears, developed methods to extract blood even from transformed beasts. The solution seems to have involved removing the skin from the beast's back, peeling it away from the spine in methodical strips. With its skin removed, the beast's wounds could not fully heal despite the rapid regeneration typical of beasts. The exposed flesh would provide ongoing access to its blood supply. Whether this was done to keep the beasts alive as sources of ritual blood, or whether it resulted from attempts at bloodletting as a cure, the outcome was the same. Creatures held in a state between life and death, their bodies perpetually exposed and vulnerable. This is what we find in the blood-starved beasts. The name itself tells part of the story. They are starved not from lack of food, but seemingly from the constant draining of their blood. They are creatures that appear to have been kept on the edge of death, their emaciated frames suggesting prolonged deprivation. The skin that hangs from their backs like a grotesque parody of a religious vestment is not a natural feature of their transformation, but appears to have been deliberately removed, inflicted by those who saw these creatures as resources to be exploited. When you encounter the blood-starved beast in the Church of the Good Chalice, pay attention to what it's doing when you first enter. It stands near the altar in this abandoned church, positioned as if guarding the sacred space. The beast attacks with desperate ferocity anyone who approaches, driven by instincts we can only interpret. Some have suggested that the chalice represents everything it once was, everything it believed in before transformation turned belief into horror. Whether the beast consciously guards the chalice or simply inhabits the space where it once served, we cannot say for certain. What we can observe is that the blood-starved beast is not simply hungry or aggressive in the way other beasts are. There's a defensive quality to its behavior, a sense that it's protecting something or holding ground rather than simply hunting prey. The creature's presence in this specific location, a church, a place of former worship and healing, suggests some connection to its past, even if that connection exists only in programming too deep to erase. The evidence pointing toward blood-starved beasts being female and possibly former blood saints includes several observations. The creature's slender build and lack of thick fur matches female beast patients rather than male ones. The poison it exudes mirrors what female beast patients inflict. The flayed skin appears deliberately removed rather than naturally shed, and the context of finding these creatures in churches and locations associated with healing rituals. While none of this proves the connection definitively, the pattern is compelling enough that many students of Yharnam's dark history have drawn this conclusion. Examine the beast's physical form more closely, and the tragedy becomes even more apparent. The emaciated, skeletal frame speaks to prolonged starvation and suffering that extends far beyond simple hunger. This creature has been denied sustenance for so long that its body has consumed itself, burning through muscle and fat until only bone remains, creating a silhouette that seems almost ghostly in its fragility. Yet, despite this apparent weakness, the beast moves with frightening speed and power, suggesting that whatever force sustains it operates beyond normal biological principles. The old blood that courses through its veins has transformed metabolism into something unnatural, allowing the beast to function despite physical deprivation that would kill any ordinary creature. The skin that hangs from its back is tattered and torn, stretched beyond its natural limits until it resembles less a part of the creature's body and more a separate entity, a grotesque cape or shroud that drapes across exposed muscle and bone. In some places, you can see where it was deliberately cut, where precise incisions were made to peel the skin away from underlying tissue. These cuts follow patterns too regular to be accidental wounds, too methodical to result from combat injuries or natural decay. Someone made these cuts with purpose, with knowledge of anatomy, with the clear intention of exposing what lay beneath, while ensuring the creature survived the procedure. The exposed flesh beneath this hanging skin is not the healthy red of living muscle, but something darker, almost purple in places, shot through with veins that pulse visibly with each of the beast's movements. This discoloration suggests compromised circulation, tissues starved of proper blood flow despite, or perhaps because of, the constant drainage the creature endured. Where the skin was torn away most completely, you can glimpse bone, yellowed and brittle-looking, bearing marks that could be from teeth or tools, evidence of violence layered upon violence. The beast's head is particularly disturbing in its wrongness. The skull seems elongated, the jaw extended beyond human proportions to accommodate teeth that have grown too large and too numerous for any mouth designed for speech or civilized eating. The eyes, when you can see them through the matted hair and shadows, glow with a dull red light that speaks not of intelligence, but of something more fundamental. Pain, perhaps, or rage so absolute that it has burned away everything else. There's no recognition in those eyes, no indication that the creature perceives you as anything more than a threat to whatever it's guarding. But it's the creature's hands, if they can still be called hands, that most clearly reveal the progression from human to beast. The fingers have elongated into claws, nails grown thick and sharp, useful for rending flesh, but utterly unsuited for any of the delicate manipulations that define human tool use. Yet the underlying structure is still recognizable as hands rather than paws, still bearing traces of the opposable thumb that marks humanity's evolutionary advantage. These are hands that once could have held things gently, that might have administered healing or offered comfort, now transformed into weapons capable only of causing harm. The beast's movements are erratic and desperate, lacking the smooth confidence of a natural predator. It lunges and swipes with the frantic energy of something driven not by hunting instinct, but by the need to defend itself against threats it can no longer distinguish. There's no strategy to its attacks, no cunning or adaptation beyond the most basic pattern of striking at whatever moves within range. This absence of tactical thinking suggests a mind reduced to its most primitive functions, capable of recognizing danger and responding with violence but unable to plan, anticipate, or learn from experience. Watch the beast between its attacks during those brief moments when it pauses to reorient itself, and you might catch something even more disturbing: a tremor that runs through its frame, a shuddering that seems to come from deep within its core. This isn't exhaustion or fear. It's the body's response to chronic pain so severe that even transformation into a beast hasn't dulled its impact. The creature exists in constant agony, every movement reminding it of flesh flayed and bones exposed, of hunger never satisfied and thirst never quenched. The fact that it continues fighting despite this pain speaks either to programming so deep that it overrides the impulse to simply lie down and die, or to a will that persists even in the absence of hope. The beast's vocalizations add another layer to its horror. Where other beasts in Bloodborne roar or howl with the full-throated confidence of apex predators, the blood-starved beast makes sounds that seem almost plaintive, rising shrieks that could be rage or anguish or some emotion for which human language has no name. These cries echo through the chapel's vaulted ceiling, creating harmonics that make the sound seem to come from everywhere at once, surrounding you with the creature's suffering made audible. In its second and third phases, as its health diminishes and the fight grows more desperate, the beast becomes even more aggressive, even more reckless in its attacks. But this isn't a strategic adaptation, the way some intelligent enemies might adjust their tactics when wounded. This is panic, the response of a creature that knows it's dying and can do nothing to stop it, that understands on some instinctual level that each moment might be its last and therefore throws itself at you with abandon, accepting injury in exchange for any chance to strike back at the source of its pain. The poison that seeps from the blood-starved beast's body in later stages is particularly telling, carrying meaning that extends far beyond its mechanical function as a gameplay challenge. This isn't venom in the traditional sense, a weapon deliberately produced by a creature to incapacitate prey. Instead, it's the corruption of the blood itself, the toxic byproduct of endless extraction, and the incomplete healing that results from being perpetually starved. The beast's blood has become poisonous because its body can no longer properly process the old blood that was once its purpose to cultivate and refine. The very thing that defined its existence as a blood saint has become a source of toxicity and death. Consider what this poisonous nature represents. As a blood saint, this woman's blood was precious, sought after, considered powerful enough to heal any ailment and purify any taint. People made pilgrimages to receive her blood, viewing contact with it as a sacred blessing. The Healing Church maintained elaborate rituals around its collection and distribution, treating it as the physical manifestation of divine grace. This blood was supposed to save lives, to elevate humanity, to bridge the gap between mortal flesh and cosmic enlightenment. Now, that same blood burns anyone who touches it. The substance that was meant to heal instead inflicts slow, creeping death, building up in the systems of those exposed until they succumb to its toxicity. The transformation from cure to poison mirrors the beast's own transformation, from healer to threat, from sacred vessel to dangerous monster. Both changes were inflicted by the same root cause: the Healing Church's refusal to recognize when its practices had become more harmful than the conditions they claimed to treat. The mechanics of the poison buildup during the boss fight create a sense of mounting pressure and inevitable contamination that mirrors the thematic content. In the first phase, you can fight the beast without worrying about poison at all. The creature is dangerous, yes, but that danger is straightforward. Dodge its attacks, find openings, chip away at its health. This phase represents the early days of blood ministration, when the healing was real and the costs seemed manageable, before anyone understood what price would ultimately be paid. In the second phase, the beast's attacks begin inflicting poison buildup, but it's slow, giving you time to retreat and use antidotes if needed. This mirrors the gradual recognition that blood ministration had consequences, that transformation was occurring but could still be managed with proper precautions. The church could still pretend that the situation was under control, that the benefits outweighed the risks, that they could continue their practices with minor adjustments to account for side effects. But in the third and final phase, the beast exudes a constant poisonous aura, contaminating anyone who comes near it regardless of whether they're hit by its attacks. Simply being in proximity to the creature becomes dangerous, forcing you to constantly manage your poison buildup while also dodging attacks and finding moments to strike back. This inescapable contamination represents the final stage of the blood curse, when the scourge became impossible to contain or deny, when the entire city was infected, whether individuals chose to participate in blood ministration or not. The poison has become so pervasive that avoidance is no longer possible. Everyone must deal with its effects, everyone must carry antidotes, everyone must accept that the air itself has become toxic. The specific nature of slow poison rather than immediate damage adds another layer of meaning. Slow poison builds gradually, giving you time to recognize the threat and respond, but also creating a sense of mounting inevitability. You know the poison is accumulating. You know that if you don't address it, it will eventually kill you. But in the moment, you have other priorities: avoiding attacks, healing physical damage, finding opportunities to deal damage yourself. The poison becomes one more thing demanding your attention, one more resource to manage, one more way that the fight drains your supplies and tests your ability to juggle multiple threats simultaneously. This perfectly captures the experience of living in Yharnam during the spread of the beast scourge. The transformation didn't happen instantly. It built slowly, giving people time to recognize what was happening, but also creating opportunities for denial. Each small change could be rationalized, explained away, dismissed as coincidence or individual weakness. By the time the cumulative effect became undeniable, it was too late to reverse course. The poison had taken root too deeply, and all that remained was managing its effects while hoping you'd survive long enough to find a cure that would never come. The visual effect of the poison is also significant. A purple-black miasma that clings to your character, visible and persistent. This visibility ensures you cannot ignore the poison's presence, the way characters in Yharnam tried to ignore the signs of the beast scourge. The game forces you to see the contamination, to watch it build, to recognize when you're in danger before the damage becomes critical. It's a mercy the citizens of Old Yharnam never received, having to discover through bitter experience that their blood had been poisoned, that their bodies were transforming, that the cure they'd been promised was actually accelerating their doom. And yet, despite everything, some fragment of purpose persists. The blood-starved beast doesn't roam Old Yharnam attacking indiscriminately. It remains in the Church of the Good Chalice, standing vigil over that altar and that chalice. Even in its transformed state, reduced to a creature of suffering and rage, it maintains a connection to its former role. It guards the sacred vessels that once held healing blood, perhaps no longer understanding why, acting on instinct and conditioning that runs deeper than conscious thought. The crucified, blood-starved beast that Djura guards in the church tower above Old Yharnam provides additional context for understanding these creatures. This beast has been strung up in a mockery of religious martyrdom, its arms spread wide in echo of crucifixion imagery. But this is not an execution. It's an extraction procedure. Large pools of blood collect beneath the suspended creature, testament to the ongoing draining process. What makes this scene even more disturbing is the presence of the beast patients surrounding the crucified, blood-starved beast. Both male and female variants gather in a circle around it, and they are drinking its blood. This ritual behavior suggests several possibilities, none of them comforting. Perhaps the beast patients seek to elevate themselves by consuming the blood of a more powerful beast. Perhaps they believe drinking from the blood-starved beast will heal their own afflictions. Or perhaps this is a religious observance of sorts, a twisted echo of communion rites that once took place in this very church. The impurity rune found elsewhere in the game seems to depict this exact scene. The rune shows a figure with arms outstretched, circles at the wrists indicating where blood is being drained. This isn't just random imagery. It's a representation of the bloodletting practices the church employed, a visual record of how they harvested blood from living creatures through controlled draining. The fact that this technique appears in a carol rune, symbols derived from the utterances of great ones, suggests that even the cosmic entities that lurk beyond human comprehension took note of this practice. Whether in horror or approval, we cannot say. The church's methodology for creating and maintaining blood-starved beasts required careful management. They needed to keep the creatures alive but weakened, capable of producing blood but unable to escape or resist. Evidence suggests they experimented extensively to perfect their technique. The crucified beast above Old Yharnam was likely one such experiment, a trial run to determine the optimal extraction procedures. The beast in the Church of the Good Chalice represents a refinement of that process, kept mobile enough to defend itself, but constrained to a specific location where the church could return to harvest its blood as needed. This practice reveals a fundamental truth about the healing church. For all its religious trappings and claims of divine purpose, the institution operated as a machine for extracting resources from the vulnerable. The blood saints were resources to be exploited. When they transformed into beasts, they became different kinds of resources, but resources nonetheless. The church's attitude toward them never changed. Whether human or beast, these women existed solely to provide blood for the church's use. The female beast patients throughout Old Yharnam seem to be at an intermediate stage of this transformation. They display characteristics of both human intelligence and beastly nature. They wear shrouds over their heads, coverings that seem designed to hide their faces and identity. Perhaps these coverings were originally meant to conceal the red eyes that mark Ashen blood infection, a desperate attempt to avoid detection and persecution. Or perhaps the shrouds represent a vestige of their former lives, a final piece of clothing retained as transformation stripped away everything else that marked them as human. These female beast patients move with more deliberation than their male counterparts. They don't simply charge and attack, they stalk, they grab, they bite with something that resembles tactical thinking. And crucially, their attacks inflict slow poison buildup, just like the blood-starved beast. This poison seems to be a unique characteristic of beasts transformed from former blood saints, perhaps related to the years of blood cultivation that altered their physiology in ways that standard beast transformation doesn't replicate. The path from blood saint to beast patient to blood-starved beast represents a complete stripping away of identity and dignity. The woman begins as a dedicated servant of the church, convinced of the righteousness and necessity of her sacrifice. She undergoes transformation into a beast through no fault of her own, paying the price for the very service the church demanded. As a beast patient, she retains enough humanity to feel shame, to hide her face, to remember what she once was. And finally, as a blood-starved beast, even that fragmentary humanity is gone, replaced by the all-consuming need to defend what little remains of her former purpose. The Old Hunter's expansion provides an additional encounter with a blood-starved beast that adds another layer to this already tragic tale. In the Hunter's Nightmare, a twisted realm where hunters drunk with blood are condemned to hunt for eternity, a blood-starved beast can be found lurking in a dark cave near the River of Blood. This is no boss encounter, but a wandering enemy, notable for several unique characteristics. First, This blood-starved beast exists in the hunter's nightmare, the realm where the most bloodthirsty and cruel hunters are sent after death to hunt forever as punishment for their sins. The presence of a blood-starved beast here suggests that the creature's suffering was so profound, its death so infused with bloodshed and tragedy, that it too was pulled into this nightmare realm. Or perhaps the nightmare itself recreates the beast as a permanent fixture of torment, ensuring that both hunters and their victims relive their worst moments endlessly. Second, this particular blood-starved beast is protected by one of Djura's followers, specifically his youngest disciple, who wields the signature Gatling gun. This hunter, who presumably participated in the burning of Old Yharnam alongside Djura, has also been drawn into the hunter's nightmare. Like his master, this disciple seems to have developed sympathy for the beasts. He stations himself near the blood-starved beast and attacks any hunter who approaches, suggesting that even in the afterlife, even trapped in this nightmare realm, he continues trying to protect the creatures he once hunted. The cave where this blood-starved beast dwells runs with a river of blood, a literal flow of crimson that courses through the nightmare landscape. This blood is not symbolic, it's tangible, viscous, the accumulated violence of countless hunts made manifest. The blood-starved beast lives in this river of blood, surrounded by the substance that once defined its existence and ultimately destroyed it. There's a horrible appropriateness to this, a sense that the nightmare has created the perfect prison for this creature. Eternal proximity to blood, but eternal starvation, forever reaching for what it can never have. Interestingly, the coding of the game reveals that blood-starved beasts are programmed to be hostile toward old hunters and their dogs while remaining neutral toward other beast patients. This behavioral programming reflects the creature's perspective during life. The hunters were enemies, threats to be driven away or destroyed. Other beasts were kin, fellow victims of the scourge who posed no threat. Even as mindless monsters, the blood-starved beasts retain this fundamental distinction, attacking hunters with ferocity while ignoring the beast patients that shamble through Old Yharnam's ruins. The Chalice dungeons provide yet another context for understanding the blood-starved beast and its role in the broader history of blood ministration. When you defeat the blood-starved beast in Old Yharnam, it drops the Thumaru Chalice, one of the ritual vessels used to access the underground labyrinths beneath Yharnam. This drop is not random. It's significant, connecting the beast to the ancient Thumerian civilization and the discoveries that led to the founding of the Healing Church. The Thumerians were a superhuman race that existed long before Yharnam was built. They carved out vast labyrinths beneath the earth, creating tombs for the great ones they worshipped and communed with. The Thumerians understood the power of blood long before the scholars of Byrgenwerth stumbled upon their ruins. They practiced blood rituals, used blood to forge connections with cosmic entities, and ultimately suffered the same fate as Yharnam would centuries later, transformation into beasts. The civilization of Loran, another ancient culture connected to the Chalice dungeons, fell to a beast scourge not unlike what consumed Old Yharnam. The ruins of Loran are filled with the remains of beasts, testament to a society that embraced blood rituals and paid the ultimate price. Blood-starved beasts can be found in the Chalice dungeons associated with both Bthumeru and Loran, suggesting that the practice of creating these creatures is not a recent invention. The Healing Church merely rediscovered techniques that ancient civilizations had employed millennia ago. This historical context adds another dimension to the tragedy. The fall of the Pthumerians, the destruction of Loran, the scourge that consumed Old Yharnam. All of these catastrophes share the same root cause, the attempt to use blood as a tool for transformation and transcendence. Master Willem tried to warn his students with his famous adage, "Fear the old blood." But Lawrence and the Healing Church refused to listen, convinced they could succeed where others had failed. The blood-starved beasts are proof of their hubris, living monuments to the price of ignoring history's warnings. In the Chalice dungeons, Blood-starved beasts appear not just as bosses in fixed locations, but as roaming enemies in randomly generated labyrinths. This suggests that the practice of creating these creatures was widespread in ancient times, common enough that multiple blood-starved beasts might exist simultaneously in different parts of the underground. The Healing Church did not invent this horror. They simply found instructions for it in the ruins below Yharnam and decided to follow those instructions, despite knowing what fate befell those who came before. The chalice that the blood-starved beast guards in Old Yharnam is specifically called the Good Chalice in the Church's name. This designation is painfully ironic. What good remains in a vessel used for rituals that transform people into monsters? What sanctity can a chalice hold when the blood it once contained led to such horror? The Church of the Good Chalice is named for an ideal that the Church itself violated, a promise of healing that became a source of torment. Yharnam's relationship with the Chalice dungeons and the discoveries made there cannot be overstated. The entire city exists because of what was found in those ancient tombs. The Healing Church was founded on the blood recovered from Pthumerian ruins. The practice of blood ministration derives from Pthumerian blood rituals. Every aspect of Yharnam's culture and society can be traced back to the moment when Bergenworth scholars descended into the tombs of the gods and brought back knowledge that humanity was not meant to possess. Gehrman, the first hunter, speaks of the Chalice dungeons with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. He encourages hunters to explore the tombs, to uncover their secrets, but there's a weight to his words that suggests he knows the cost of that knowledge. Gehrman was there at the beginning, a contemporary of Lawrence and Willem, a witness to the founding of the Healing Church and the creation of the Hunter's Workshop. He has seen firsthand how blood worship transforms individuals and societies, and now, bound to the Hunter's dream by Lawrence's contract with the Moon Presence, Gehrman is condemned to train hunters to fight beasts in an endless cycle that achieves nothing except perpetuating the violence. The connection between blood-starved beasts and the Chalice dungeons suggests that these creatures serve a purpose beyond simply being sources of blood. They are gatekeepers of sorts, guardians of the rituals and knowledge associated with the chalices. The beast in Old Yharnam guards the Pthumeru chalice, the key to accessing the ancient labyrinths. Other blood-starved beasts in various chalice dungeons guard deeper chalices, each one unlocking access to more dangerous and profound areas of the tombs. Perhaps the Pthumerians deliberately created blood-starved beasts to protect their holy vessels. Perhaps these creatures represent a final test, a challenge that must be overcome before one can access the deeper mysteries of blood worship. Or perhaps the placement of blood-starved beasts as guardians is simply a result of their nature. Creatures too damaged to roam freely, anchored to the last vestiges of their former purpose, defending the sacred spaces they once served even though they no longer understand why. The symbolism of the blood-starved beast extends beyond its immediate tragedy to encompass broader themes about exploitation, suffering, and the cost of progress. The beast represents what happens when institutions treat people as resources rather than individuals. It embodies the consequences of religious authority prioritizing power and doctrine over compassion and truth. The creature's very existence poses uncomfortable questions about how far it's acceptable to go in pursuit of healing and transcendence. Consider the choice the game presents regarding Djura. Most players, on their first playthrough, simply kill him to stop the Gatling gunfire that makes traversing Old Yharnam so difficult. But the game offers an alternative. You can approach Djura from behind, after having defeated or at least triggered the Dark Beast Parl boss fight, and he will speak with you peacefully. He explains his position, his belief that the beasts of Old Yharnam deserve protection rather than further persecution. And he gives you a choice. Will you hunt the beasts, or will you spare them? This choice matters not because of any tangible gameplay reward, but because of what it says about the player's understanding of Bloodborne's world. If you've paid attention to the environmental storytelling, If you've read the item descriptions and connected the narrative threads, you realize that Djura is right. The beasts of Old Yharnam are victims, not villains. They were infected with Ashen blood, treated with blood ministration, and transformed against their will. They were then burned alive by hunters carrying out the church's cover-up. And now, even in death and transformation, they continue to suffer as hunters descend into the ruins to practice their skills on easy targets. To spare the beasts is to acknowledge their tragedy, to refuse participation in the cycle of violence that the healing church set in motion. It's a small act of mercy in a world largely devoid of mercy. And while the beasts themselves cannot appreciate the gesture, having long since lost the capacity for gratitude or understanding, the gesture matters anyway. It matters as a rejection of the hunter's traditional role, as a statement that not everything that looks like a monster needs to be hunted. The blood-starved beast encapsulates all of this thematic weight in a single encounter. When you face this creature in the Church of the Good Chalice, you are not simply fighting a boss for gameplay purposes. You are confronting a monument to institutional evil, a victim of exploitation that has been transformed into something that can only respond to the world with violence. The beast attacks you because it has been conditioned through unimaginable suffering to view all humans as threats. And it's not wrong. Every human it encountered in its transformation, from blood saint to beast to blood-starved beast, treated it as something to be used and discarded. The fight itself is appropriately brutal and desperate. The blood-starved beast attacks with frantic energy, leaping and swiping with erratic timing that makes it difficult to predict and counter. As the fight progresses and the beast grows weaker, it becomes more aggressive, more reckless, throwing itself at you with the fury of something that knows it has nothing left to lose. The poison that builds up from its attacks forces you to choose between maintaining offensive pressure and backing off to heal, creating a risk-reward calculation that mirrors the beast's own desperate existence. In the final phase, when the blood-starved beast is near death and its body exudes a constant poisonous aura, there's a terrible poetry to the mechanics. The creature has become so toxic, so corrupted by what has been done to it, that simply being near it causes harm. It has been turned into a source of poison, unable to interact with the world except through causing suffering to others. And it will continue fighting until you finally kill it, until you provide the mercy of death that the healing church denied it for so long. After the fight, when the blood-starved beast lies still and you claim the Pthumeru chalice from its corpse, take a moment to consider what you've really accomplished. You've ended a creature's suffering, yes. You've obtained a key to deeper mysteries, certainly. But you've also participated in the same cycle of violence that created the beast in the first place. The hunter who defeats the blood-starved beast is not a hero. They're just another person doing violence to something that has already suffered far too much violence. This complexity is central to Bloodborne's narrative approach. The game doesn't present clear moral categories of good and evil, heroes and villains. Instead, it shows you a world where nearly everyone is a victim of circumstances beyond their control, where the institutions that claim to offer salvation are often the sources of greatest harm, where the line between hunter and hunted grows increasingly blurred until it disappears entirely. The blood-starved beast is not unique in its tragedy. Throughout Bloodborne, you encounter characters and creatures that have been destroyed by the world they inhabit. Gascoigne, the hunter who succumbs to bloodlust and must be killed by his own daughter. Vicar Amelia, devoted servant of the church who transforms into a beast mid-prayer. Ludwig, the holy blade, who becomes a nightmarish horse beast while still clutching the ideals he served. Even Lawrence himself, the first vicar of the healing church, ends his days as a cleric beast burning with unquenchable flames in the hunter's nightmare. But the blood-starved beast stands apart from these other tragedies in one crucial way. The others chose their paths. Gascoigne chose to hunt. Amelia chose to serve the church. Ludwig chose to lead the church's hunters in their holy mission. Lawrence chose to defy Willem's warnings and pursue transcendence through blood. They made choices, and those choices led to their downfall. The blood-starved beast made no such choice. The women who became blood saints were chosen by the church, often at young ages before they could truly understand what they were consenting to. They were groomed and conditioned to see their exploitation as sacred duty. When they transformed into beasts, it was not because of any decision they made, but because the church's blood ministration carried an inherent risk that the church knew about and chose to ignore. And when the church decided to flay their skin and harvest their blood, keeping them alive in perpetual agony, the blood-starved beasts had no say in the matter. This complete absence of agency makes the blood-starved beasts' tragedy particularly profound. These creatures never had a choice, never had a chance. From the moment they were selected as blood saints, their fates were sealed. The church would use them until there was nothing left to use, and then it would discard the remains. The blood-starved beast is the endpoint of that use, the final form of exploitation so complete that nothing remains of the original person except a poisonous husk guarding a chalice it no longer understands. The body horror of the blood-starved beast serves as a visual representation of this complete destruction of self. The flayed skin hanging from its back literalizes the stripping away of identity and dignity. The skeletal emaciation speaks to being consumed utterly, drained of everything that sustains life. The erratic, desperate movements reflect a mind fragmented by suffering, unable to form coherent thoughts or purposes beyond the most basic imperatives of defense and survival. And yet, despite all this, some essential quality persists. The beast returns to the Church of the Good Chalice and stands vigil. It defends the chalice from those who would take it. Something in the creature recognizes that this place and this object matter, even if it can no longer remember why. This persistence of purpose in the absence of understanding might be the most tragic aspect of all. The blood-starved beast continues to serve the institution that destroyed it, continues to guard the symbols of a faith that betrayed it, because that conditioning runs so deep that not even complete transformation can erase it. When players share their experiences with Bloodborne, the blood-starved beast often comes up as a significant challenge, a difficulty spike that tests whether they've mastered the game's combat mechanics. Discussions focus on strategies for avoiding the poison buildup, optimal times to dodge, whether to summon cooperators or face the beast alone. And while these tactical considerations are valid and important for gameplay, they miss the deeper significance of the encounter. The blood-starved beast is not difficult because it's a well-designed boss fight, though it is that. It's difficult because it represents something that should be difficult, confronting the consequences of institutional evil. The fight doesn't feel good in the way that defeating a tyrant or monster feels good. There's no sense of triumph when the blood-starved beast finally falls. There's only exhaustion, relief that the ordeal is over, and perhaps a growing unease as you begin to understand what you've really been fighting. This discomfort is intentional. Hidetaka Miyazaki, Bloodborne's director, has spoken in interviews about his desire to create games that evoke complex emotional responses that resist simple categorization as fun or entertaining. Bloodborne excels at this ambiguous emotional territory, presenting scenarios where victory feels hollow and defeat reveals uncomfortable truths. The blood-starved beast epitomizes this approach, creating an encounter that's simultaneously a gameplay challenge and a narrative indictment of the player's complicity in the world's cruelty. The fact that defeating the blood-starved beast is technically optional only reinforces this theme. You don't have to kill it to complete Bloodborne's main story. You can avoid Old Yharnam entirely if you choose. But most players don't, because the lure of exploration and the promise of rewards draws them down into the ruined district. We go to Old Yharnam not because we must, but because we choose to, just as the healing church chose to exploit the blood saints. just as Lawrence chose to ignore Willem's warnings. Our choices, like theirs, have consequences that ripple outward in ways we might not fully understand until it's too late. The ongoing presence of blood-starved beasts in the Chalice dungeons serves as a reminder that this tragedy extends far beyond a single creature in Old Yharnam. The practice of creating these beasts has ancient roots and apparently enjoyed widespread use at the height of Thumerian and Loran civilizations. How many blood saints have been sacrificed over the centuries? How many women have been chosen, conditioned, transformed, and finally reduced to poisonous husks, guarding forgotten chalices in lightless tombs? The number must be staggering, a body count that spans millennia. And the practice continues. Even as Old Yharnam lies in ruins and the Healing Church's authority crumbles, the mechanisms that create blood-starved beasts remain in place. The Church still selects blood saints. They still administer blood ministration, despite knowing the risks. They still exploit the vulnerable in pursuit of transcendence and power. The cycle persists because the individuals within the Church, like Lawrence before them, convince themselves that this time will be different, that they can succeed where others failed, that the ends justify the means. This is perhaps the darkest truth Bloodborne presents, that institutions perpetuate themselves through the suffering of others, and that suffering becomes normalized, accepted as necessary for the greater good. The blood saints themselves internalize this logic, viewing their exploitation as sacred duty, seeing their worthlessness except as sources of blood. Adela and Adeline both express this mindset in their dialogue, unable to imagine existing as anything other than vessels to be drained. The Church has so thoroughly conditioned them that they cannot conceive of their own value as human beings. Breaking free from this conditioning requires external intervention, someone to point out that the system is wrong, that the sacrifice is unnecessary. Djura represents this voice of dissent in Old Yharnam, the hunter who breaks rank to declare that the beasts deserve protection rather than persecution. But Djura's position is lonely and precarious. Most hunters dismiss him as foolish or mad. The few allies he has are fellow heretics, hunters who have likewise rejected the traditional role and now find themselves hunted in turn by those who remain loyal to the Church's doctrine. The player's choice to spare or hunt the beasts of Old Yharnam extends this dynamic into the realm of player agency. Will you perpetuate the cycle, or will you break it? Will you see only monsters in need of killing, or will you recognize the victims beneath the monstrous forms? The game doesn't force a choice or punish you for choosing wrong. It simply presents the situation and allows you to decide what kind of hunter you will be. For those who do choose to spare the beasts and earn Djura's trust, the reward is modest, a gesture and a badge that unlocks some equipment for purchase. The real reward is subtler and more meaningful, the knowledge that you refused to participate in unnecessary violence, that you extended mercy where the game's world rarely offers it. It's a small act of resistance against the cruel logic that dominates Yharnam, a statement that not everything the Healing Church sanctifies is actually holy. The blood-starved beast cannot be spared in this way. By the time you encounter it, the creature is too far gone, too consumed by suffering and rage to respond to anything but violence. The kindest thing you can do for it is kill it quickly and end its torment. But this mercy comes too late, offered only after everything else has already been taken. The beast deserved mercy when it was still a blood saint undergoing its first transformations. It deserved mercy when the Church decided to flay its skin. It deserved mercy at any point before reaching the state you find it in. Offering mercy now is like closing the barn door after the horses have fled, a gesture that changes nothing but might ease your conscience. Yet even this delayed mercy matters. Throughout Old Yharnam, you can find messages scrawled by previous hunters, warnings about ambushes and difficult enemies ahead. One message, found near the Church of the Good Chalice, reads simply, "Have mercy on the poor bastard." It's unclear whether this refers to the hunter reading the message, the one who wrote it, or the blood-starved beast itself. Perhaps it refers to all three. Perhaps everyone in Old Yharnam, living and dead, hunter and hunted, is a poor bastard deserving of mercy in this place where mercy is in such short supply. The atmosphere of Old Yharnam reinforces this pervasive sense of tragedy. The smoke that perpetually rises from the ruins, the charred corpses that line the streets, the desperate moans of beast patients who retain just enough humanity to sound anguished. All of it combines to create an environment soaked in suffering. And at the heart of this suffering sits the Church of the Good Chalice, the place where the healing church's grandest promises and darkest practices intersect. There's a reason the blood-starved beast makes its lair in a church, rather than some random building or cave. The church represents everything the creature used to believe in, the faith that sustained it through years of painful blood cultivation, the institution it devoted its life to serving. That the church has become a place of horror rather than sanctuary mirrors the beast's own transformation from devoted servant to tormented monster. Both the building and its guardian are shells, empty of everything they once represented, maintained only by habit and conditioning too deeply ingrained to abandon. The vines that grow through the church are sickly and wrong, fed by poisoned earth. The altar where the chalice rests is stained with old blood, the accumulated residue of countless rituals. Even the light that filters through the broken windows seems tainted, casting everything in shades of crimson and shadow. This is a place where hope died long ago, where faith curdled into despair, where the promise of healing became a sentence of suffering. And yet people still seek out the chalices. Hunters still descend into Old Yharnam to claim the Pthumeru chalice from the blood-starved beast's corpse. The tomb prospectors venture into the chalice dungeons, risking madness and death to recover ritual materials from Pthumerian ruins. The cycle continues because the lure of transcendence remains irresistible, because people convince themselves they can succeed where others failed, because the healing church's fundamental message that blood holds the key to evolution and enlightenment continues to seduce those desperate or ambitious enough to believe it. Master Willem understood this seductive quality of the old blood, which is why he preached his famous adage, "Fear the old blood." He knew that blood promises easy answers to difficult questions, rapid solutions to slow problems. He knew that people would be tempted to use blood despite understanding the risks, because the potential rewards seemed worth any price. And he knew that those who succumbed to that temptation would ultimately be consumed by it, transformed into the very beasts they hoped to transcend. The blood-starved beast is living proof of Willem's wisdom. Here is a creature that exists because the healing church refused to fear the old blood, because Lawrence and his followers convinced themselves they could control forces beyond human comprehension, because the promise of transcendence blinded them to the cost of pursuing it. Every blood-starved beast that has ever existed represents a failure to heed Willem's warning, a decision to prioritize ambition over caution, power over compassion. But the tragedy extends beyond the church's choices to encompass all of Yharnam. The citizens who eagerly embrace blood ministration, seeking healing or enhancement, bear some responsibility for creating demand that the church must supply. The hunters who descend into Old Yharnam to practice their skills on weakened beasts, treating the ruins as a training ground, perpetuate the cycle of violence that the blood saints first experienced. Even the player, by choosing to fight the blood-starved beast rather than walking away, becomes complicit in this system of exploitation and cruelty. This complicity is uncomfortable to acknowledge. Most players don't think about the moral implications of their actions in video games. They see an enemy and fight it, seeking the satisfaction of overcoming a challenge and claiming the reward. Bloodborne disrupts this unthinking engagement by embedding its bosses with backstories that recontextualize the act of fighting them. You're not killing monsters. You're killing victims who have been transformed into monsters. and your participation in their deaths makes you part of the same system that created them in the first place. The blood-starved beast forces this uncomfortable recognition more effectively than perhaps any other boss in the game. Its appearance is so viscerally disturbing, its flayed skin so obviously the result of deliberate mutilation rather than natural development, that players cannot help but question what they're looking at. And once you start asking questions about the blood-starved beast, what is it? How did it get this way? Why does it guard a chalice in a church? You inevitably uncover the larger story of the Blood Saints and the Healing Church's exploitation of them. This revelation doesn't make the fight easier. If anything, understanding the tragedy makes it harder, because you can no longer view the blood-starved beast as simply an obstacle to overcome. It becomes a person, or the remnant of a person, someone who deserved better than the fate that was inflicted upon her. Killing her feels like a mercy, yes, but also like a failure, an admission that the only help you can offer comes in the form of a blade. The presence of Alfred near Old Yharnam adds another layer to this complex moral landscape. Alfred is an executioner, a member of the church faction dedicated to hunting vile bloods, practitioners of forbidden blood techniques. He's friendly to the player, offering information and assistance. But his zealotry is unsettling, his devotion to his mission so complete that he celebrates the violent destruction of his enemies without questioning whether that violence serves any purpose beyond perpetuating ancient grudges. Alfred's proximity to Old Yharnam is significant. He represents the church's self-righteousness, the conviction that their cause justifies any cruelty. When you listen to Alfred speak about the vile bloods, about the necessity of purging them from existence, you're hearing the same logic that led to the burning of Old Yharnam and the creation of the blood-starved beasts. It's the logic of absolute certainty, the belief that some people or things are so fundamentally wrong that they must be eliminated without mercy or hesitation. This absolutist thinking pervades Yharnam's culture. The mobs that roam the streets during the hunt, attacking anyone they perceive as tainted by the scourge. The hunters who kill first and ask questions never. The church officials who classify certain blood as forbidden without explaining why. Everyone is so certain of their righteousness, so convinced that their violence serves a higher purpose, that they never stop to question whether that purpose justifies the means employed to achieve it. The blood-starved beast exists because of this refusal to question, this unwillingness to examine the cost of pursuing transcendence through blood. The church wanted a steady supply of healing blood, so they created the system of blood saints. When the blood saints transformed into beasts, the church saw an opportunity to extract even more blood from them, so they developed techniques for keeping the beasts alive while harvesting their blood continuously. At no point did anyone in the church's hierarchy apparently ask whether this was acceptable, whether the suffering inflicted was worth the benefits gained. Or perhaps they did ask, and decided the answer was yes. Perhaps the church understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway, deciding that the suffering of individual blood saints was an acceptable price for the salvation of humanity through blood ministration. This possibility is even more disturbing than thoughtless exploitation because it suggests deliberate evil rather than mere callousness. The architecture of the Healing Church's buildings provides some insight into this question. The Grand Cathedral, the church's seat of power, is enormous and ornate, filled with gold decoration and soaring arches. The upper cathedral ward, where the choir conducts its research, is similarly luxurious. But the research hall, where experiments on living subjects take place, is a nightmare of poor conditions and medical equipment used for torture rather than healing. The church clearly had resources to spare, yet chose to house its test subjects in squalor while surrounding its leadership with luxury. This division reveals the church's priorities. The blood saints and research patients were never truly members of the church community. They were tools, resources to be used and discarded. The church's grandeur was built on their suffering, quite literally, as the upper levels of the grand cathedral rest on foundations of exploited blood. And the church saw nothing wrong with this arrangement, because from their perspective, the blood saints existed to serve the church's purposes. Their suffering was simply the price of fulfilling their function. The players who make it through Old Yharnam and defeat the blood-starved beast gain access to the Chalice Dungeons, ancient labyrinths that contain both great treasures and terrible truths. Venturing into these dungeons reveals the long history of blood worship and its consequences. The Pthumerians built their entire civilization around communion with great ones through blood rituals. They achieved wonders through this communion, extending their lives and gaining superhuman abilities. But in the end, they too fell to the scourge, transforming into beasts and losing everything they had built. Loran's ruins tell a similar story. The Chalice dungeons associated with Loran are filled with beast corpses and architectural remnants of a once great culture. Like the Pthumerians, the people of Loran sought to elevate themselves through blood. Like the Pthumerians, they instead doomed themselves to transformation and extinction. The pattern repeats across civilizations and centuries. Blood promises transcendence, but delivers only corruption and death. Yharnam is simply the latest iteration of this ancient cycle. The Healing Church discovered the old blood in Pthumerian ruins and made the same mistakes the Pthumerians made millennia ago. They convinced themselves that they would succeed where others failed, that they understood the blood well enough to use it safely. And like all who came before, they were wrong. The scourge spread through Yharnam, just as it had spread through Loran and Thumaru. The beasts multiplied. The hunts became more frequent and more desperate. And the blood-starved beasts, tragic remnants of the church's exploitation, stand as monuments to this repeated failure. There's a futility to all of this that Bloodborne doesn't shy away from. The game presents a world where the cycle of blood worship and beast transformation has repeated countless times across history, where each civilization believes itself different from those that came before, where everyone makes the same mistakes and suffers the same consequences. The player character, despite their abilities and determination, cannot break this cycle. They can kill beasts, uncover truths, even potentially transcend humanity by consuming umbilical cords and resisting the moon presence. But they cannot save Yharnam from the consequences of its choices. The blood-starved beast embodies this futility. No matter how many of these creatures you defeat, more exist in the Chalice dungeons, created by ancient civilizations long dead. Killing the beast in Old Yharnam changes nothing about the broader pattern of exploitation that creates such creatures. The Healing Church continues its practices. The blood saints continue being selected and transformed. The cycle persists, indifferent to individual suffering or resistance. And yet, there remains something important in bearing witness to that suffering, in taking the time to understand the story written in the blood-starved beast's mutilated form. By uncovering the truth of these creatures' origins, by recognizing them as victims rather than merely monsters, we refuse the Church's narrative that dismisses them as unfortunate casualties of necessary progress. We assert that their suffering matters, that their stories deserve to be remembered, that the Church's exploitation of them was wrong, regardless of whatever benefits it might have provided. This is all we can offer the blood-starved beasts: recognition, remembrance, the refusal to forget. We cannot save them or undo what was done to them. We can only acknowledge that they existed, that they suffered, and that their suffering was not justified by the goals it served. In a world as dark as Bloodborne's, where nearly everyone you meet is doomed and nearly every quest ends in tragedy, this act of witnessing becomes its own form of resistance against the forces that would render suffering invisible and acceptable. The journey through Old Yharnam, culminating in the encounter with the blood-starved beast, serves as an education in the true nature of Yharnam's society. You begin the game believing you're in a city plagued by a beast curse, that your role is to hunt the beasts and cure the plague. As you progress, you gradually realize that the beasts are symptoms rather than causes, that the real plague is the healing church and its blood worship, that hunting accomplishes nothing except perpetuating a cycle of violence that serves the church's interests. Old Yharnam represents a crystallized moment in this realization. Here is an entire district sacrificed to the church's need to conceal its failures. The residents were infected, transformed, and then burned alive. The survivors became the beasts you fight as you explore the ruins. And at the heart of it all, the blood-starved beast stands guard over the chalice that represents everything the church promised and everything it destroyed in pursuit of those promises. When you finally defeat the blood-starved beast and claim the Pthumeru chalice, you're not really winning anything. You're simply taking the next step deeper into Yharnam's cursed history, accessing the tombs where all of this began. The chalice dungeons don't offer answers or solutions. They offer only more questions, more evidence of the blood curse's ancient origins, more proof that what's happening to Yharnam has happened before and will happen again. But in that repetition, in that circular nature of Bloodborne's narrative, there's a truth worth confronting. That systems of exploitation perpetuate themselves across time and space, that every generation believes itself different while making the same mistakes, that breaking these cycles requires more than individual heroism or good intentions. The blood-starved beast can be killed, but the system that creates blood-starved beasts remains intact. Defeating the boss doesn't solve the problem. It simply removes one symptom while the disease continues spreading. This might seem hopeless, and in many ways it is. Bloodborne doesn't offer comfortable resolutions or clear paths to fixing what's broken, but there's value in understanding the system even if you can't break it, in recognizing exploitation even when you can't prevent it. The player who fights the blood-starved beast with full knowledge of what the creature once was, who understands the tragedy of its existence and grieves that tragedy even while doing what the game requires, is different from the player who sees only a boss to defeat and loot to claim. That difference might seem minor in the scope of Bloodborne's world, but it's everything in the scope of how we engage with stories and systems. The game asks us to see beyond surface appearances, to question the narratives provided by authority figures, to recognize victims even when they've been transformed into monsters. It asks us to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge our complicity in systems we participate in, to understand that killing beasts doesn't make us heroes when the real villains are the institutions that create those beasts in the first place. The blood-starved beast is not the most difficult boss in Bloodborne. It's not the most mechanically interesting or visually impressive, but it might be the most important because it represents the game's central thesis about the nature of suffering and exploitation. This creature exists to demonstrate what institutions are capable of doing to individuals, how sacred language can mask profane acts, how the pursuit of higher purposes can justify the most degrading cruelties. Every time a player encounters a blood-starved beast, whether in Old Yharnam or the Chalice Dungeons or the Hunter's Nightmare, they're confronting this thesis again. The game refuses to let you forget what these creatures represent. It places them in locations tied to the church's history and activities, ensures that advancing through certain progressions requires engaging with them, makes their presence unavoidable for anyone seeking to fully explore Yharnam's secrets. This insistence on confrontation is deliberate. Bloodborne doesn't want you to be comfortable, doesn't want you to slide through the experience without engaging with its darker implications. The blood-starved beast forces that engagement through its disturbing appearance and the environmental context surrounding it. You cannot fight this creature without wondering what you're fighting. You cannot defeat it without feeling that the victory is hollow. And if you care enough to seek answers, the game provides them, revealing a story more disturbing than the creature's physical appearance could suggest. So when you stand before the blood-starved beast in the Church of the Good Chalice, about to engage in combat with this desperate, starving, flayed creature that was once a woman devoted to healing and service, Take a moment. Look at what the healing church created. Understand what you're about to do and why. Recognize that in this moment, you're not a hero defeating a monster. You're an executioner ending the prolonged suffering of a victim. One final act of violence in a life defined by violence, providing the only mercy that anyone in Yharnam seems capable of offering, the mercy of death. And then, when it's over, and you hold the Pthumeru chalice in your hands, remember what it cost to create this beast, what it cost to defeat it, what it will cost to continue down the path that the chalice opens. Remember the blood saints and their exploitation. Remember Old Yharnam and its burning. Remember Djura standing alone on his tower, trying to protect beasts that no one else believes deserve protection. Remember all of it, because in a world as dark as Bloodborne's, remembering might be the only truly revolutionary act available. The tragedy of the blood-starved beast is not that it exists. The tragedy is that its existence was preventable, that it represents choices made by people who knew better, that it stands as evidence of how institutions prioritize their own perpetuation over the well-being of individuals. The tragedy is that this creature lived and suffered and died in service of a system that viewed it as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. The tragedy is that even now, even after everything we've learned about the cost of blood worship, the cycle continues. But perhaps there's something else here too, something beyond tragedy. Perhaps there's a lesson in the blood-starved beast's persistence, in the way it returns to the Church of the Good Chalice, despite having every reason to flee, in how it guards that chalice even though the institution it represents destroyed everything the beast once was. Perhaps that persistence speaks to something in the human spirit that transcends even complete transformation, a stubborn refusal to abandon purpose even when purpose no longer makes sense. Or perhaps that's giving the situation too much credit, looking for meaning in meaningless suffering, trying to find redemption in a story that offers none. Perhaps the blood-starved beast's return to the church is simply conditioning too deep to overcome, the final cruelty of an institution that shaped its victims so completely that they continue serving even after being destroyed. Perhaps there's no meaning here at all except the brutal arithmetic of exploitation. The church needed blood. Blood saints provided blood, and when the saints transformed into beasts, the church found ways to continue extracting value from them until nothing remained but poisoned husks. The ambiguity is characteristic of Bloodborne's approach to storytelling. The game presents situations without providing definitive interpretations, allowing players to draw their own conclusions while ensuring those conclusions are informed by the evidence scattered throughout the world. Some players will see the blood-starved beast as a tragic victim deserving sympathy. Others will view it as a dangerous monster that must be eliminated. Both perspectives contain truth, and the tension between them is what makes the encounter meaningful. What's undeniable is that the blood-starved beast has become one of Bloodborne's most memorable and discussed enemies, transcending its role as an early to mid-game boss to become a symbol of the game's themes and approach. Players returning to Bloodborne years after their first playthrough still remember the blood-starved beast, still feel that same discomfort when confronting it, still find new details in its design and placement that deepen their understanding of what it represents. This lasting impact speaks to the power of using game design to tell stories, of embedding narrative in visual design and environmental context rather than relying solely on cutscenes and dialogue. The blood-starved beast's flayed skin tells a story. Its location in a church tells a story. The chalice it guards tells a story. The beast patients drinking blood from its crucified cousin tell a story. Every aspect of the encounter contributes to a larger narrative about exploitation and transformation, about institutions that consume the individuals they claim to serve. As we close out this examination of the blood-starved beast, it's worth reflecting on what makes this creature's story relevant beyond Bloodborne itself. The game is set in a fantastical Victorian nightmare city with giant beasts and cosmic horror, far removed from our everyday reality. But the mechanisms of exploitation it depicts are not fantastical at all. They're depressingly familiar. Institutions that prioritize their own survival over individual well-being. Authority figures who justify cruelty as necessary for greater goods. Systems that transform victims into resources and then blame those victims for their suffering. The parallels to real-world exploitation are impossible to ignore once you start looking for them. The Blood Saints were women selected young and groomed to serve an institution's needs, taught that their value lay solely in what could be extracted from them. Their bodies were not their own, but belonged to the church, to be used in whatever manner the church deemed necessary for advancing its mission. They were simultaneously revered for their sacred role and looked down upon for the contact with blood and disease that role required. This contradictory status, essential but disposable, sacred but demeaned, mirrors the position of countless workers throughout history who perform necessary but stigmatized labor. Think of the nurses and caregivers who provide essential medical services while being undervalued and underpaid. Think of the domestic workers who maintain households while being treated as invisible by those who benefit from their labor. Think of the agricultural workers who produce the food that sustains entire nations while living in conditions of poverty and precarity. The specific circumstances differ, but the underlying dynamic remains constant. Certain people are designated as resources whose suffering is acceptable because of the services they provide to others deemed more valuable. The Healing Church's treatment of blood saints also reflects a pattern found in religious and medical institutions throughout history: the exploitation of vulnerable people under the guise of sacred or scientific purpose. The women who became blood saints genuinely believed they were serving a higher calling, that their suffering had meaning and purpose. The Church encouraged this belief, framing their exploitation in language of holiness and divine mission. This rhetorical strategy, presenting exploitation as privilege, suffering as service, allows institutions to extract extraordinary sacrifices from people, while those people thank the institution for the opportunity to be exploited. We see this pattern in historical cases like the Radium Girls, young women who painted watch dials with radioactive paint and were assured by their employers that the work was perfectly safe even as they began dying of radiation poisoning. We see it in medical experiments conducted on marginalized populations without informed consent, justified as necessary for advancing scientific knowledge that would benefit humanity as a whole. We see it in religious orders that extracted free labor from members while promising spiritual rewards that never materialized. The specifics vary, but the structure remains consistent. Powerful institutions identify vulnerable populations, frame exploitation in terms of higher purpose, and extract maximum value while providing minimum protection or compensation. The transformation of blood saints into blood-starved beasts represents the logical endpoint of this exploitation. When the women could no longer serve their original function due to transformation into beasts, the Church simply found a new way to extract value from them. Their transformation didn't end their usefulness, it simply redefined the nature of that usefulness. This adaptability speaks to how thoroughly institutions can commodify the people under their control, viewing them not as individuals with inherent worth, but as collections of potentially useful properties to be exploited until nothing valuable remains. This pattern of continued exploitation, even after fundamental transformation, connects to real-world situations where institutions extend their control over people beyond what seems possible or reasonable. Consider how employers sometimes pursue legal action against former employees who leave to work for competitors, treating people as if their labor and knowledge remain company property even after employment ends. Consider how prisons in some jurisdictions use incarcerated people as unpaid or severely underpaid labor, continuing to extract economic value from individuals who have already paid significant penalties for their crimes. Consider how debt can follow people through decades of their lives, transforming a single financial decision into a perpetual obligation that affects everything from housing to employment opportunities. The flaying of the blood-starved beast's skin represents perhaps the most visceral metaphor in all of Bloodborne, the complete stripping away of protective boundaries until the vulnerable interior is permanently exposed. This image carries weight beyond its immediate horror, speaking to how exploitation removes the social and psychological defenses that allow people to maintain dignity and autonomy. When institutions treat people as resources, they systematically strip away the boundaries that define individuals as separate from their functions, until nothing remains except the capacity to be used. In our world, this stripping of boundaries manifests in numerous ways. Workers in some industries are expected to be available around the clock, their personal time viewed as company property that can be claimed whenever business needs demand. People in service industries are required to suppress their authentic emotional responses and perform scripted pleasantness even in the face of abuse. Individuals seeking public assistance must often submit to invasive questioning about every aspect of their lives, surrendering privacy as the price of survival. Each of these situations involves the removal of boundaries that would normally protect individual autonomy, leaving people exposed and vulnerable to extraction by more powerful entities. The symbolism of the church setting for the blood-starved beast encounter also carries significant weight. Churches and religious institutions are supposed to be places of sanctuary, offering protection and comfort to those who seek them. The corruption of this sacred space into a site of horror mirrors how institutions that position themselves as sources of salvation often become sources of harm. The gap between religious rhetoric about compassion and care and the reality of institutional behavior creates a particular kind of pain. The betrayal of trust, the discovery that the entity you turn to for protection is actually the source of your suffering. History provides numerous examples of religious institutions engaging in exploitation while maintaining rhetoric about charity and service. Residential schools that destroyed indigenous cultures while claiming to provide education. Orphanages that subjected children to abuse while accepting donations meant for their care. Churches that amassed wealth while their parishioners lived in poverty. The specific details vary across cultures and time periods, but the fundamental dynamic persists. Institutions that claim moral authority, using that authority to justify actions that would be recognized as wrong if committed by entities without such authority. The blood-starved beast's persistent return to the Church of the Good Chalice, its refusal to leave, despite having every reason to flee, reflects how deeply institutional conditioning can affect people even after that conditioning has led to their destruction. This mirrors how people who have been harmed by institutions often continue defending those institutions, unable to recognize or acknowledge the harm, because doing so would require dismantling the entire framework of meaning they've built their identities around. Victims of abuse sometimes become defenders of their abusers. Workers whose loyalty has been betrayed continue showing loyalty to employers who don't reciprocate. Believers whose faith has been exploited cling more tightly to that faith rather than confronting the possibility that their suffering was meaningless. This phenomenon speaks to how thoroughly institutions can shape identity, making it nearly impossible for people to imagine themselves apart from their institutional roles. The blood saint who has been taught since childhood that her value lies in providing blood cannot easily conceive of herself as valuable for any other reason. When transformation removes her ability to perform that function in the approved manner, she doesn't seek a new identity, but continues trying to fulfill the old one, guarding chalices and churches, because that's what blood saints do, even though she can no longer understand why. Breaking free from this conditioning requires extraordinary effort and often external intervention. Djura represents this possibility. Someone who participated in the system, recognized its cruelty, and chose to reject it even at great personal cost. His transformation from hunter to protector of beasts required him to abandon his connection to the hunter's dream, to give up the advantages and certainties that role provided, to stand alone against the tide of hunters who would continue the violence he'd renounced. This choice is available to everyone complicit in exploitative systems, but it demands sacrifices most people are unwilling to make. The difficulty of making Djura friendly in the game, requiring specific sequence of actions, easily disrupted by a single misstep, reflects how hard it is to break from institutional loyalty and violence in real life. You must approach from a specific direction, having achieved certain milestones, without committing violence where Djura can see it. These mechanical requirements mirror the social requirements for breaking from violent systems. You must have achieved certain perspectives that allow you to see the system's flaws, must approach the possibility of change from the right angle, must refrain from participating in the system's violence, at least in contexts where your choice is visible. One slip, one moment of succumbing to old patterns, and the opportunity is lost. The fate of Djura's companions adds another layer to this examination. We know that at least one of those who shared his cause ended up in the hunter's nightmare, that realm where hunters drunk with blood are condemned to hunt eternally. This suggests that even well-intentioned attempts to break from violent systems may fail, that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, that the stain of past violence may prove impossible to fully wash away. The disciple who guards the blood-starved beast in the nightmare is still protecting it, still carrying out the mission Djura set, but he's doing so in a realm of eternal torment rather than ever achieving peace or redemption. This grim possibility haunts anyone who tries to make amends for past participation in harmful systems. Can reformation truly occur, or will past actions continue to define us regardless of present choices? Can institutions be reformed from within, or must they be abandoned entirely? Can victims of institutional exploitation ever truly recover, or has the damage run too deep? Bloodborne doesn't provide comforting answers to these questions. Instead, it presents situations where the best possible outcome still involves significant suffering, where choosing to do less harm doesn't erase the harm already done, where recognizing a system's cruelty doesn't automatically provide a path to escaping that system. The blood-starved beast exists at the intersection of all these themes: exploitation, transformation, institutionalized violence, the corruption of sacred purpose, the impossibility of true redemption. It is simultaneously an individual tragedy and a representation of systemic evil, a specific creature with a specific history and a symbol of broader patterns that repeat across time and space. Understanding the beast requires holding both these perspectives simultaneously, recognizing its particular suffering while also acknowledging what that suffering represents. The blood-starved beast represents all of this in a form we can encounter and engage with, giving us the opportunity to literally fight against the end result of exploitation, even if we can't fight the system that creates it. This externalization of systemic violence into a concrete enemy we can face allows us to process complex themes through the framework of gameplay, to feel the weight of these issues in a way that purely intellectual engagement might not provide. And perhaps that's the final significance of the blood-starved beast. It takes something abstract, the way institutions exploit vulnerable people, and makes it visceral, immediate, impossible to ignore. You cannot fight the healing church directly in Bloodborne. It's too diffuse, too embedded in the fabric of Yharnam's society. But you can fight the blood-starved beast, and in doing so, you confront one concrete result of the church's practices. The fight becomes a referendum on the system that created the beast, a chance to reject through action what cannot be rejected through dialogue or choice. This is what makes Bloodborne storytelling so effective. It transforms thematic content into gameplay content, making sure that players don't just learn about the horror, but experience it directly. The blood-starved beast isn't just a sad story you read in an item description. It's a creature you fight, whose attacks you must learn to avoid, whose desperate final moments you witness personally. The emotional impact of this direct engagement far exceeds what exposition alone could achieve. So, the next time you descend into Old Yharnam, past Djura's warnings and through the charred remains of a district sacrificed to conceal the healing church's failures, and you step into the Church of the Good Chalice to face the blood-starved beast once again, remember this story, remember the interpretation many have drawn, that this creature may once have been a woman chosen for her merit as a vessel for blood. If this reading holds truth, remember her years of service as a blood saint, the countless transfusions she would have endured, the conditioning that taught her to view herself as nothing more than a resource. Remember her transformation into a beast, the horror of losing herself piece by piece to the corruption of the old blood. Remember what the evidence suggests about the final exploitation: skin deliberately removed to access blood more easily, turning her into a perpetual source of suffering. Remember all of it, and carry that knowledge with you as you fight, because in the end, all we can offer the blood-starved beast is recognition. We cannot save it or undo what was done to it. We can only acknowledge the suffering its form suggests, bear witness to the tragedy written in its mutilated body, and refuse to accept any narrative that exploitation on this scale could ever be justified or necessary. We can interpret the evidence before us, that this creature likely was once a person, that they deserved better, and that their story matters even though the world of Bloodborne has tried to forget them. This is what makes the blood-starved beast truly tragic. Not its appearance or its attacks or even its death at the player's hands, but the knowledge that it exists in a world that views its suffering as acceptable, as unavoidable, as the price that must be paid for progress and transcendence. The beast is a victim twice over, first of the system that destroyed it, and second of the collective amnesia that allows that system to continue operating unchallenged. But we don't have to participate in that amnesia. We can choose to remember. We can choose to see the blood-starved beast not as an obstacle to overcome, but as evidence of crimes committed, a monument to institutional cruelty that demands recognition and acknowledgement. We can let its story inform our understanding of Bloodborne's world and the forces that shape that world. And perhaps in some small way, that remembering matters. Thank you for accompanying me on this deep dive into one of Bloodborne's most disturbing and tragic creatures. The blood-starved beast's story is not an easy one to confront, but it's essential for understanding what Bloodborne is really about beneath its surface of Victorian Gothic atmosphere and challenging boss fights. I hope this exploration has given you a new appreciation for the depth of thought and care that went into creating this creature and the world it inhabits. If you found this analysis valuable, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider liking and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories hidden in the shadows of our favorite games, waiting to be uncovered and understood. I'll be here, shedding light on those stories, helping us all appreciate the artistry and meaning woven into the games we love. Until next time, good hunting, and may you always remember those who suffered to make the worlds we explore possible.